Good evening and welcome to another episode of Free Media, Free Minds, the show where we look at issues of media freedom and freedom of expression in South Africa at the moment. I think everyone who's watching probably has a cell phone. And one of the slogans of the alternative media movement is be the media. But with cell phones today, we really can be the media. So tonight we're going to be looking at social media, cell phones, Facebook, Twitter. With me in the studio, I have David Lewis from Medialternatives, Pastor Tlola Skosana from the New Life Church, and Catherine Dutoli from Cell Life. Welcome, guys. Before we get into the discussion, we're going to have a look at an insert on this issue.
If you talk about social media and democracy, I think it's already demonstrated over the last couple of years that there's a clear link. Probably on a number of levels, social media has been used by citizens to participate more effectively in the news processes. It's been used by people to organize activist events, demonstrations, mobilizing people to get together. And on another level, social media has made mainstream news more accessible in some way. So people are talking about mainstream news events and important political events using social media. They're using social media spaces to gather, to discuss these things, and in some ways that contributes to them being more well-informed citizens who can participate in democratic processes. So on a number of levels, I think social media has shown that there is some use of it in terms of promoting democracy. Mobile phones are just a medium. I think that's something quite important that we have to keep in mind. So whether it's social media or mobiles that people are using to organize themselves or to participate in a democracy, to some extent is irrelevant, because if mobile phones and social networking were not there, they'd be using other media, other forms of media to participate in exactly the same ways. I think in terms of its effectiveness, people can inform themselves better in terms of what the technology is capable of. So I think as citizens, as activists, one thing we can do to use social media or mobile phones more effectively is to really become techies, is to teach ourselves about the limitations and also the possibilities of the medium in order to enable us to use mobiles as effectively as possible. So one example of that is that many studies have shown that people who have access to the mobile internet, so accessing the internet using their mobile phones or their cell phones, often only use social media. So they're going onto the internet to use Facebook and to use Twitter, to use Foursquare, but they're not really using Google or reading news online, for example. With the internet, as with mobile phones, there are always issues around regulation and control. And certainly regulation limits our ability as activists or as citizens to really use mobile phones to organize in terms of political protest and so on. There's always the danger that we can be cut off. The idea of surveillance is always problematic. So certainly, monopoly ownership, restrictive regulations around mobile phones have serious consequences. But of course, there are ways around that as well. But certainly, that is something that's quite limiting in terms of the potential possibilities of the medium. I think in terms of RICA, the concept behind it was probably good, but I think that the implications in terms of personal freedoms and issues around surveillance are probably an unexpected consequence of the policy. So I don't think that was probably very well thought through.
Well, there you have it. I think what is referred to as new media, social media, credited with the uprisings and revolutions in Egypt, London. David, give us a quick breakdown. What is social media?
Gosh, it's part of the new disruptive technologies that are basically overthrowing the dominant discourse created by mainstream media. So a lot of people are quite afraid of the implications of having instant access to broadband internet. Yeah.
So with access to internet, comes the ability to produce media and access media made by other ordinary people, just like you and me.
Right.
I mean, in South Africa today, how many people have access to the internet? Is this not just an elite thing that we're talking about? Catherine?
There are definitely constraints. In terms of people's access to the internet via their computers, it's very constrained. Figures that I've seen have been around about 11%. Cell phones are giving more people access, but as has been mentioned, it's often just for Facebook or for Mixit. There you are actually using an internet type connection, but you're using it to chat with your friends or for social media. It doesn't mean that you're not using the internet, it's just you're using it with a particular goal in mind. So in terms of, I looked up some figures, and if we look at, there's something called the Living Standards Measure, and LSM 1 to 5, 15%, according to figures from a Nielsen survey, are using the internet, and 6% of people in that group, that's LSM 1 to 5, were using the mobile web. So it's still, it's a growing area. We've got a way to go.
Yeah, but I mean, how many, if you accept that internet on a computer is a fairly elite thing, 10% of the population, how many people in South Africa have cell phones at the moment, and can cell phones in the future provide internet access?
I think the expectation is that very, very many more people will be accessing the internet via their mobile phones compared to computers. In terms of the number of people with mobile phones in South Africa, it's also quite a hard figure to put down. The International Telecommunications Union says that there's about 50 million connections in South Africa. That's mobile connections, which actually gives us like 100% of people. Some of those could be doubles. Other research says about 76% of South Africans.
I really think we're going off on a tangent. I mean, you can talk stats and figures and prices of phones and the price of the technology, but we all know that the smartphone revolution is coming, and whether you have access to a phone or not, what we're seeing are different social changes where, for instance, the Occupy movement has become a worldwide global occupation of the planet. So Occupy climate change, for instance, activists very quickly hashtag Occupy COP17, for instance, changes the whole relationship of what were formerly consumers, the population dumbed down by corporate capitalism and the corporate media, where the mainstream media now has to play catch up. Yeah. So the different social movements which are evolving over citizen journalism and like super news, for instance.
Yeah, and I do think the statistics are backing that up. Increasingly, every household, even the poorest rural household, does have a cell phone. And increasingly, those cell phones are becoming more and more media production tools.
Yeah, I just want to interject there. I mean, the stats that I've got on smartphones is that 10% of South Africans have a smartphone. And it's something like 65% have a feature phone. And then the 25% are what are called dumb phones, which can just SMS. So I think we're at the beginning of those changes, and we have to acknowledge that it's a certain sector of society that
is a disruptive technology.
Let me bring in Tola here. You're involved in movement building in Khayelitsha. What's your experience? Do people have access to cell phones, the internet, and how are you using that to build your movement?
Yeah, well, I tell you, I wish I was as smart as my 15-year-old, who is grounded at the moment, and therefore I've taken a phone. But she says to me the other day, I don't need that phone anymore because I need, and then she mentions the name of another smartphone. That's. Well, my own experience in the community that I come from is, I mean, it's you have almost every second person you see in the street is, has a cell phone. And in fact, somebody said the other day that in fact, if you were to ask South Africans to vote using their cell phones, the chances are you would include a whole lot more people.
Yeah.
into that voting system. Just the possibilities, and I'm thinking the banks are now opening up to
Cell phone banking.
cell phone banking. You know,
But for those of us who are interested not in more banking but in more democracy, what are some of the ways that cell phones can be used? Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, the area that I work in is more using cell phones for health, but and I'm sure that David will be able to talk to this as well. We can see globally in terms of what's been happening, for instance, in North Africa, that cell phones can be used to mobilize and to spread information. In fact, even when governments choose to shut things down, for instance, like shut down the mobile web, then other ways will be found where people can leave voice messages to get their message out.
Let's talk about the content revolution and the attempt by regulators to grab back control over content. Because we all, the BlackBerry fiasco, where the Department of Home Affairs has a completely different view to the Department of Communications, and we're all fighting over the right to encrypt your data on a mobile platform. So there's a whole.
Can you explain to us what
stuff.
is encryption? And what relevance is it to this discussion?
Well, this is the thing. The relevance is it's a regulation debate over the old order perceiving new technologies as a threat. So they passed a law called RICA. So they spent billions, and the service providers were forced to spend a lot of money on intercepting your mobile communications. Then what happens is the technology basically subverts the order and creates a way of bypassing censorship through encryption. So encryption is a way to hide information. It's a way to secure your privacy, and the right to privacy is in the Constitution. It's one of the rights that we've fought for. So you can link the struggle all the way back to grassroots and the South African struggle for freedom.
Yeah. So we need privacy so that we can communicate and organize.
Right.
And of course, it's very worrying that something like the RICA law and the technology itself, the companies that make these phones, cooperate with authorities to compromise your.
Right. The IBM case is a very good example. It's still pending. It's a US, I think the Second Circuit, one of the circuits. They've gone to the next level, but basically the case is all about back in the 80s, activists, anti-apartheid activists, were apprehended by the state, apartheid state, who were using IBM technology, and of course you all know that there were sanctions and there was a boycott. And so now this case is still pending. It's one of the longest running cases in history. And the mainstream media in this country hasn't been covering the story, because we all know that the mainstream media is essentially the same apartheid media in wrapped up in a different clothing.
I mean, and of course the promise of cell phones and social media, your Facebooks and Twitters, are that they can give citizens access to information and the freedom of expression without having to depend on what David refers to as the apartheid, the mainstream commercial media in South Africa. Your experience?
Yeah. Well,
do they meet the promise?
Well, just from my own personal experience, again, our church and many other churches have been working closely with the Right to Know campaign, and so we were learning a lot in this process. Initially, we thought this was just a media struggle. Then it was broadened to access to information, and so we're discovering more and more now that in fact in the hands of ordinary people who carry